Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremando for YogaUOnline, and I'm here today with Donna Brooks. Donna is a certified yoga therapist, a somatic movement educator and therapist, and she's been teaching yoga since 1981 and somatics and mind-body work since 1983. Donna has studied with some of the great teachers. Her Iyengar teachers include John Shoemaker and Karen Steffen. And she has studied with some of the real most esteemed practitioners in the field of somatic work, including Moshe Feldenkrais, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. I hope I'm saying this right, Donna. Is it Emily Conrad?
It's Emily Conrad.
Emily Conrad. And she's also trained in the healing groundwork of Judith Blackstone. She incorporates simple but profound embodiment exercises into the work that she does. She's created therapeutic programs and classes for students working and clients living with various conditions that are as diverse as persistent pain, Parkinson's, pelvic floor disorder. But what we're going to talk about today is a topic that is really relevant as we're entering this third year of the pandemic, and that is the trauma brought about by grief and loss. So while I've mentioned some of the great teachers you studied with, Donna, you actually have a personal perspective on pain, loss, and grief that few of us do and none of us want. And you've said that that was your greatest teacher. Certainly things that have happened in my life that have been horrible have been my greatest teacher, but I first want to say welcome.
Thank you.
And then I just want to say that your experience is a perfect example of sometimes our greatest teachers being the things we encounter, the ups and downs and all of the things that really take us to the depths of understanding of who we are and what our resources are and how resilient we are. And in your case, it was just an unspeakable tragedy, the death of your son. So if you're comfortable talking about that, can you just share a little bit about that experience?
I absolutely can and will, Lynn. And I do want to say one thing, I never studied with Moshe personally. I studied actually with one of his senior teachers, Thomas Hanna. So
Thomas Hanna just as good. Yeah. Okay.
That kind of difficulty.
Okay. Thank you.
But I will talk about my experience. So, and I will say there was a little foreshadowing. So my son always had migraine headaches, which isn't really that unusual for someone to have migraine headaches. And, being very, not just yoga oriented, but holistically oriented, I always tried to address it in different ways, and nothing seemed to really help his migraines. And he's a very powerful person. At the time of his death, he was starting a trajectory of quite a bit of fame, actually. And when he died, we hadn't realized what reach. He was a podcaster and an author, and his podcast affected people all over the world. We got feedback from people in Russia and Jordan and Ireland and South Africa, people who listened to him. And people can Google him if they'd like. It's Michael Brooks, and it's the Michael Brooks Show. My daughter's working on a legacy project. There's a lot of material. And also famous people, President Lula of Brazil tweeted out about him. Marianne Williamson was a fan. We had no idea. Cornel West
Wow.
wrote a very, very lovely, almost like a eulogy. So basically what happened was I got a phone call on a really nice day. I was actually waiting to go in to see my acupuncturist, and I got a phone call that Michael was in the hospital in the ER. And, I knew it was serious because a doctor called me. A doctor called me and told me I needed to get there right away, and that he had a blood clot that traveled up to his heart He had a saddle clot, which cuts off the communication of blood, the flow of blood between the lungs and the heart. And so I was in Massachusetts and my son was living in Brooklyn. So I was madly getting ready to get down to Brooklyn. And this is during COVID. You know, my daughter calls me, she's in Los Angeles, so she's catching a flight. And then right as I'm about to get in my car to drive to Brooklyn, my daughter calls me and tells me my son died. And I literally collapsed. I've never had that experience in my life before, but it was like the ground wasn't there and I just really fell to the floor. Mm-hmm. And that started, I don't know, a whole series of embodied experience, somatic experience that wasn't really pleasant. I think already at this point in my life, I've lived by a philosophy that says, you know, the only way out is through. Like I already knew, as difficult as this was, I couldn't avoid it. And that said, we have these protective mechanisms in our experience that allow us to just only process what we can process at the time. And you mentioned Judith Blackstone as one of my teachers, and yeah, she has this quote about how trauma is, I'm paraphrasing, so it's not exact, but trauma is only what we can't process in the moment. And another really important teacher to me, Bonnie Cohen, is a little bit more technical about how this moves through the nervous system. But yes, your nervous system kind of creates a suspension of what you can't process at the time. Yeah. And hopefully over time, if we're safe enough, we can start letting these experiences up, in, and through, meeting them through our bodies.
You know what you made me remember? When my father died, he dropped dead. Similar situation. And for months afterward, I would be like I just would wake up and realize I had been reading the paper at some point, but I would just be kind of just gone. Yeah. Just I had left.
Yes. Yes.
We think of grief as a one-dimensional thing, but in fact, I think it has a lot of different faces and facets, and how we respond to things can be very varied. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So what happened was I started feeling like, oh my God, I'm having like trauma responses. And I want to say there's disagreement about whether like you should call grief a trauma or not. I mean, it really does depend on your definition of, but what I started reading about trauma fit to grief with me. Now, that said, in the process of grieving, a lot of these sort of trauma symptoms should naturally kind of lessen or subside. And when they don't, it's called like traumatic grief. And what happens is the trauma of the grief dovetails with other trauma that hasn't been processed, and it makes it huger. So there's, I think there's like a natural trauma response, and I'll talk about that more with grief. But I think also if it doesn't move, something else is going on that's kind of glued to that.
Can I also bring in the word loss? And because I think these are connected, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but people going through a divorce, there's a kind of a grief process there. People who, because of COVID, have lost their careers, there's a grieving process there that has to do with loss. It's not, to me, the word grief, it gets conflated with I lost a person, but isn't it a bigger picture? Isn't there more to it?
I think that one of the things that's really true in our culture is that to be alive is to experience loss. And so there's many, many different ways of loss. You know, aging comes with a lot of loss, right? I mean, people losing their careers, people with COVID losing friendships, losing access to the coffee shop.
Yeah.
Early on in COVID, I had a couple of students who their parents had died and they didn't have memorial services or funerals. So there was actually a loss of the grieving
They
process.
couldn't say goodbye in the hospital.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, and I think that, well, I'll speak for myself. I mean, I'm 61 and I feel like generationally, I'm too young to have experienced polio. I wasn't an intravenous drug user or not, a gay guy. So, aside from the initial fear about AIDS, it didn't impact people I knew, even though certainly that's been a pandemic. And we've not lived through war that's personally touched us. We've not lived through hunger and starvation. So a lot of the things that human beings have experienced all through the world, all through times, has been, we haven't had that in our particular culture and country, in our particular history. I mean, our, parents and grandparents went to war. Maybe there was no war here, but a lot of them went to war.
Yeah.
And so that kind of protection, I think, really dulls us to the reality that being human is facing a tremendous amount of loss. And really recognizing that. I think when my son died, because I'm kind of a historian and an anthropologist, those are really my loves before doing yoga and body stuff. I just realized that a mother losing her son, or perhaps losing any child, has been more or not something that humans have always had to deal with. And it's only been this special kind of protection that we haven't had to deal with that.
But there's something, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
There's something also, there is a sweetness about having had the privilege, sometimes the grieving process is whether it's for your job or your marriage or your person that you lost, it's where you discover how valued, how treasured this thing has been in your life, or this person was to you, that what a privilege it was to have walked with that person in your life. And the grief is a way of honoring that, isn't it?
I should send Martin Prichtel an email because I'm selling a lot of his books for him. He has a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, and my light is falling, and my light fell, but I still have another light, so I think we're okay. The Smell of Rain on Dust. And this book talks about loss of all kinds. And the premise of the book is that grief and the praising of life come together. And I think it's what you're saying, that you really can't have one without the other. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say Thich Nhat Hanh, no mud, no lotus.
Oh, nice. Yes. No mud, no lotus. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what you made me think about. Yeah.
And this idea too that, it's horrible, but it's loss that makes us value life. Can
you say that author's name again? Because I know people are going to want to read that.
Yeah, Martin Prichtel, Prectal. And the book is a very unusual title, The Smell of Rain and Dust. And it's not just losing people, it's amputation. It's
loss.
In one chapter he talks about, which is also very appropriate for what our country's going through, the loss of nation, or tribe or nation, that what we've thought was our country. It's like, oh my God, why is this happening? This is not my country.
Yeah.
And it seems like that is happening no matter what side of the political spectrum people are on. It's like, I don't recognize my fellow Americans. And he talks about this as a loss that many nations and tribal people have gone through from trauma. And so it kind of brings us back to trauma, if it's okay that I segue into that.
Absolutely, sure.
So what happens is grief is a natural process, absolutely, and an inevitable process in terms of being human. But the way our culture is, we don't really encourage grief. It's very compartmentalized, and for some of us more than others of us, some people still have family traditions that really deal with grief. Some people have friends that are more conscious that grief has to roll out for a longer period of time. But when you think about it, by and large, something happens and you're supposed to get over it and get back to work. I mean, that is really a lot of our culture. And what happens is that stops the unwinding of the trauma. And when it stops the unwinding of the trauma, it freezes us. And that's when depression sets in versus sadness. And I noticed this, that because it's really not fun to let the grief over loss, whatever kind of loss it is, unwind. It's not a pleasant, it's not like, going to the beach and walking in the waves. It's hard, difficult stuff that can be really feel terrible. Mm-hmm. So, but if we put a stopper on that, it's like energy stops moving, flow stops moving, and we can get depressed, right? And that was my particular signal. I knew if I got depressed, I was impeding my process. And of course, this is all happening through COVID, so I didn't have a lot of community around me. There were a few times I set things up outside with a few people, but it wasn't like, tons of people coming to your house with food and making you laugh and crying with you. So what happens is, for me, it was depression. For someone else, it could be anger or bitterness, but there's a kind of holding, a kind of rigidity that happens if we don't unwind what the grief is over the loss and allow ourselves to process that.
So it sounds like, and I think what I was experiencing was freeze. I think I was just having massive freeze. So
Yes.
So this will take us to one of our favorite topics, which is how yoga can help. Because a lot of times, again, when people think yoga, they go asana. But there are so many other practices, and this is where you have really, all of your life's work probably came into play in your recovery or your ongoing process. But can you just talk about how yoga and nervous system regulation through yoga can be very helpful at such times?
Absolutely. So yes, my first response as well, that collapse is, if we look at Polyvagal Theory, which is kind of the, kind of talking point of now, Polyvagal Theory, and it has overlap with a more classic, I really have a lot to say about this. Okay. So in Polyvagal Theory, yes, like if you are in a place where you have to assess threat, you can't act, you have to assess it, or the threat's there and there's nothing you can do about it, you freeze. So if you're freezing to assess a threat, it is more like the cat in the mouse's mouth, where you just kind of like, your muscles get really tense, but you don't do anything. You're just kind of holding this. And a lot of us have this for various reasons. There's a lot of grief in life we haven't processed, right? So that can manifest as kind of an always frozen tension. And I'll talk about yoga and this in a moment. So that's part of what in polyvagal they call that dorsal vagal, that lower vagal response that's more freeze-like. This freeze is actually a combination of sympathetic and parasympathetic, because you are revved up, you just can't go anywhere with it.
Yeah.
The collapse is more pure parasympathetic.
Okay.
Right? And that's not something that life can really sustain. People can't walk around collapsed.
Yeah. But
it does happen. And that has like more of a decrease in heart rate, decrease in blood pressure. There can be disassociation with both of these, like a feeling of being spaced and disconnected. But the more traditional freeze is not entirely disconnected, because you're still kind of looking to see if there's a way out. When there's no way out, there's no way out. And certainly one argument I've heard about freeze's protective qualities is that it actually prepares us for death, that kind of disassociation, or that slowing down of vitals actually is because we think and know that we're going to die.
Mm.
And I feel like, for me, the intensity of loss was such that, initially I felt like I really couldn't go on. But the freeze is protective, right? In the sense that if you think of it as animals in the wild, it is, if I can freeze, then maybe the predator won't see me.
Yeah.
And I can wait. And so there's a protective mechanism of that emotionally too, I think, I felt, is that the freeze protected me from the overwhelm of experiencing this all at once, which I never would have been able to process. I mean, I could barely cognitively grasp that this happened. And in terms of COVID, I think it's taken going into the third year of the pandemic for a lot of us to cognitively grasp, like, oh my God, this is really happening.
Yeah.
It's so far out of our scope.
You were talking about the protective mechanism, and I'm remembering that in my own case, when I would wake up from freezing, oftentimes I was at work, which would have been the worst place in the world to fall apart and have a, crying jag and have people around me go, what's going on over here? But you were going to talk about the yoga piece of how both you used it or how we might use it if we're experiencing loss.
Yes. So it's really interesting. And I just want to talk about the sympathetic response, what in Polyvagal they call the sympathetic response first, because I think this is a very individuated process. So for me, I definitely went into this more, what they call dorsal vagal freeze kind of reaction first. My daughter immediately went into her sympathetic. So the sympathetic looks really different. And there's kind of different ways of doing the sympathetic, fight and flight. So you could be really, anxious and worried and avoidant, or you could be really angry and really go to get things done. And so the sympathetic is more blood pressure up, muscles tight, but muscles aren't just tight. The sympathetic nerves bring blood to the somatic system. They guide that process. So why I need to mention this in terms of yoga is because for some people, yoga needs to be very, very active. You're sympathetic, you're fight and flight, and you need to discharge that kind of tension. And then for other people, it's more about creating the safety and relaxation, yoga nidra, restorative asana, recreating the safety that lets you come back in so you don't disassociate, so you can basically feel that you're back entered into your own experience.
Now, you also do a lot of work with sound. How does sound, especially from this perspective, not just talking to each other, not just words, sometimes words aren't going to cut it. How do you use sound for?
Well, I think everything that we use, so think of like more tribal communities. It's like there's a loss, and again, it doesn't have to be a loss of a person. It could be loss of crops. It could be loss of farmland. It could be, people carried away. There's loss. And then the most important thing is that people come together, because this is all what allows us to keep the energy of grief moving is safety. So what creates safety? So different things create safety: being held, being hugged, singing, dancing, just being contained by others, moaning, groaning, crying, chanting, singing, wailing. And now science knows that that has an impact on your nervous system. So, right now it's very popular to think of this vagus nerve as basically the most important arbiter in terms of the nervous system and our emotions and our reactions. So there's research on chanting and moaning and crying being able to give us good tone in the vagal. And it's something that, again, we're really, it was very interesting. I felt like I needed to moan when my son died. And I started looking it up on the internet, like who facilitates moaning. And I found that there's this old Irish practice, and maybe it's keening was the original name, but it became contaminated by the church. Like, I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying contaminated. It became altered by the church. So the original keening let people rip with whatever was in there to come out with sounds in whatever way. And that was sort of seen as too primitive. So it got codified into a kind of chanting. And not to say that that chanting doesn't help people. And was the purpose of chanting to lead us into moaning, or did moaning and really letting that agony come up? So the agony is coming up from the gut, and that is, this dorsal bottom vagal kind of, gut wrench, collapse, freeze, it's the end is near. If the sound can arise from that and be expressed, what is that sound?
Yeah, awesome. Now you are teaching a course for us very, very soon, Stepping Safely into Chaos of Grief, Embodiment Tools for Meeting Loss and Difficulty. Is this kind of what you'll be covering? Is this material what we've been talking about? Is that what your course will be?
Absolutely, absolutely. And also working with principles of embodiment. So this is a word that's becoming very popular now. It's kind of like is becoming the new mindfulness. But what I would say is that embodiment's not really something we do with our will. We are embodied beings. And if you would give me one more quote, I love this Maria Popova quote. Oh, maybe I don't have it. Oh, shoot, I don't have it here. Okay. It's this idea that the only place we really live is our bodies. But we spend a lot of time either distracting from them, right? Which again, can be really protective. I'm not going to distracting. But when it's chronic, we distract from them and we don't really situate ourselves in our bodies. But yet our bodies are the only place where we experience life. So when we distract, or maybe we don't distract, we discipline our bodies. We make sure, we've got our, 20 minutes of vigorous asana, or 20 minutes of relaxing asana, or we go for our runs, or, and I'm not saying these things aren't valuable, they are, but embodiment is really pulling the curtains away from what a genuine experience within your body is. So in the course, we're not just gonna look at what the vagus nerve is, or some of the associated cranial nerves. We're actually going to see if we can allow them to live as they are. And what does that do to our experience of ourselves and our body and our consciousness if we just see if we could drop in and let them live as their own thing.
So a bit of theory and a lot of experience.
There's definitely experiential. I've tried to balance it. And then the practice video will be based on my experience of needing to meet collapse and freeze and fight and flight, and some sounding and stillness meditation.
Well, Donna, this has been so illuminating. Thank you for sharing your story. I know it can't have been easy, but I think it would be very helpful for people to understand we can walk with these things and come back from them. And
we have to, to come back to the very beginning. I think it is really true that generationally, culturally, nation-wise, we've been spared from a lot of normal everyday grief. that
Mhm.
through most of human history has walked with us
Yeah.
and has been part of human development and experience.
Well, I'm really looking forward to your course, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see you there. And thank you again for sharing so generously today.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure to speak with you and have such wonderful questions and probing. I love that.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.